You're now tuning in to Performotion Podcast, where we talk powerlifting and rehab with our coaches, guests, and exercise physiologists. Hello everyone, and for our last episode of this segment of Foundations of Our Lifts, we're going to be covering deadlifts today. And for this one, I guess it could break into two main parts, conventional and sumo. So, slight differences when you do stand with your feet wider, but we'll cover that today. So starting off with conventional, I think it is the more simple deadlift variation that we could look at when we are trying to explain it. So I guess it could form sort of the skeleton of what we'll talk about, and then it still applies to sumo. But I think what we could talk about starting off is talking about how the deadlift setup breaks down. So I like to think of it as three main components that we can explore. We've got the pre-hinge, so hinging down before you grab the bar. You've got the slack pull, and then you've got the wedge, right? I think if we follow that framework today, it'll be a good spot to explain everything, and then we could talk about the little details that go into each of those portions. So starting off with the pre-hinge. First off, when we talk about conventional deadlifting, a deadlift is a hinge, right? So it's pushing the hips back, trying to feel the hamstrings, glutes, and the extensors all working together to extend the bar, right? I think one common issue when people are starting out to deadlift and they don't have the concept of a hinge is they essentially push the knees forward and they almost squat to the bar, right? So opening up to you guys, Sam, did you want to talk about, the differences between a hinge versus squatting the bar and how that relates to conventional?
Yeah, man. So essentially, obviously, like with deadlifts, obviously we don't have like the eccentric component like squat and bench where we're able to kind of feel the weight of the bar and generate that kind of stretch reflex or power from the bottom. So with the deadlift and the setup, like you said, it's a little bit different. We want to kind of use the setup and the pre-hinge to generate as much kind of power and tension with the barbell to help push off the floor and lift as much weight as possible. So typically, like when we look at conventional deadlifts and sumo as well, but more specifically with the conventional, in the hinge position, it's typically most successful or more efficient by generating power from the heels to the toes. So in order to kind of be able to propel that bar off the floor from the dead position, we want to be able to find ourselves in a bit more of a hinge position, starting with the weight a bit more in the heels, and then we generate that power by driving forward into the toes. And then that's where we'll be in a position where we're then, over midfoot and pushing through the ground. So typically the difference is from like a efficient starting position versus not is, like you said, what we don't typically like to see is someone squatting down too much. So that would be typically where they're starting too far over the bar. So some signs you can kind of look out for will be the knees traveling too far forward, the shoulders too far over the bar, or simply just kind of looking cramped up with the barbell versus a bit more of an efficient position where, like I said, we're starting with a bit more weight in the heels. So we're starting off bar or behind the bar, I like to call it, which gives you room to then drive forward into the toes and push off the floor. So when we look at that starting position, someone who's like squatting too much is basically affecting their ability to generate power by driving heels to toes because they're already in the toes.
Yeah. Cool. And I think you explained a lot about like someone squatting the bar forward or starting too far forward. Have you seen, I guess, observations where people set up too far back as well?
Yeah, definitely. There obviously is that balance point, like anything, right, in terms of achieving this optimal balance with the barbell. Typically, with someone starting too far back, they're going to have that little kind of hip shift off the floor anyway. So typically, if someone's too far forward, you'll see the hips kind of kick up and away from the barbell. And the same kind of thing can happen if you're too far away from the bar. The barbell will push forward away from you off the floor, and then to compensate, the hips will generally shoot up as well. Just like the same thing if you're too far forward. So when we're looking at kind of maintaining position off the floor and being nice and efficient, we essentially want to try and maintain the same hip height off the floor while the legs are pushing. So typically, if we're seeing those big deviations in the hips kind of being too low than shooting up, that can be a sign of, if you're either too far forward or too far back.
Yeah, I think hip position is really important place to start. And like if you can own that position before you've even gone to grab the bar, adding that part into your routine as you set up and keeping that constant, like not changing the hip position too much, whether it's too high or too low every time and trying to get that consistent, I think is really important part of your setup for the deadlift. Um, I
Yeah.
guess that also goes hand in hand with breathing and bracing as well. We've covered breathing and bracing in pretty much all of our squat, bench, and deadlift episodes. But for deadlift, I guess it's most similar to squat, but there still is a slight difference, right? We're not trying to gain as much, I guess, tension in the core and create this full 360-degree brace such as squat, but we're also not pushing it all into the chest either. It's much more loose. Um, Leanne, did you want to
Yep.
talk about breathing and bracing and I guess how it could feed into the slack pull as well as, being able to reach for the bar?
Yep. So I guess with a deadlift, like you said, it's not so much the 360 brace. I feel like some people tend to overdo the brace with a deadlift. So I know some people tend to breathe, like take their brace at the top. But for me, I find taking it at the bottom, like after the pre-hinge, is enough tension to be able to hold the brace and feel strong through the torso to lift. So I guess yeah, not necessarily taking a massive gulp of air into the chest. It's more so, I guess, for me, I think about more lower into the abdomen, just to feel that tension around the belt. And then from there, off the ground, you should feel like you have, I guess, sufficient tension through the torso to then just be able to generate force through the ground with your legs. So I guess that kind of like leads into the wedge portion of like the lift where like once you've pre-hinged and then you take your brace, that's where you then wedge into the bar, and then it's the, I guess, the tension and slack pull through the arms as you're pushing with your legs. So yeah, rather than overthinking a brace, I think like with time it like just becomes very natural and you're not necessarily thinking about bracing every single rep. But yeah, rather than overthinking and taking a massive breath in, just kind of like let it flow through the reps rather than like taking your breath in at the top, resetting and like making it really rigid and robotic. It's kind of like just let it sort of flow through the reps and like through the set if you're doing more than one rep.
Yeah,
Let it
I agree with that.
flow. Let it flow.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point of not overdoing a brace, right? And I think with deadlifts it's especially important because I guess one, when we talk about breathing and bracing and when you perform that exhale and you feel the abs, that could end up, I think it's easy in deadlift for you to almost round over and put yourself in this more flex position, right? Especially if you are trying to over brace and try and create that stability. Um, and it kind of feeds into the way the lift goes in terms of sticking points, right? We'll circle back later, but I guess if you do start off the ground super braced hard and you start in that flex position, eventually you're going to have to undo all that work and unravel it to extend and lock out, right?
Yeah. It's
Um,
like
yeah,
just really quick. It's like, with squat and bench we get our kind of stability with that brace, right? Like being as tight as possible, big air into the chest, big air into the upper back, into the abs. Like with deadlift, it's almost like, we get our stability from being more fluid, but also getting those positions right in your setup. So if you have like your lower back, your hips, your shoulders, everything in the right spot, off the floor, you're not going to get pulled by the barbell as much. So that in a sense is going to give you the stability because you're not getting ragdoll by that heavy weight. So trying to be that fine line between fluid and just making sure everything's in the right position, coming off that dead stop is going to give you the stability versus trying to get really tight and rigid in that starting position.
I'm going to
yeah,
very quickly jump in and just touch on like me being someone who can do both conventional and sumo from like a performance perspective. And I would say like the things that I think about either in sumo and in conventional are like, I'm not going to say they're very different, but they are definitely different in like what we're kind of talking about now. And I would say for me personally, my brace in sumo is probably softer compared to how I would brace in a conventional. Just because of like the extension that is needed for a conventional deadlift. Like, you definitely need to be able to hold more of like an extension and more of a hinge each rep, whether it's rep work or singles. So I would say I typically would kind of focus on a little bit more of like I wouldn't even say it's hard either, but I definitely brace or focus a little bit more on like that extension and like that feeling of sort of like creating tension in the conventional. Whereas when I sumo, I'm just flowing with it. Like, every rep, it's just like all I'm kind of focusing on for sumo is where my foot pressure is, and I'm just letting the rest kind of happen. So that would be like my own sort of like take on like, one, being able to do both movements where like my leverages don't really change, but like my thought process does a little bit. And the only thing I would add from like what we've already spoken about, Sam and I did a post on it, is definitely like eye gaze or head position. And that kind of comes to like, that goes back to like the pre-hinge, and like, if we're looking down at the bar or at the feet, like that can influence your chest position, whether you're holding, I guess, natural, like extension, or if we're flexing. And then it can change that first rep. And I think one of the things I've noticed with like a lot of clients is, in a set of reps, if the first rep is off, it's usually coming down towards probably that finer detail of like where that eye gaze is, because we'll commonly see the person have the eyes down during that pre-hinge, and then as soon as they do one rep, they keep their eyes on that gaze where it moves up, and then the rest kind of just flow more naturally. So that would be one other thing I would kind of just add into like what we've spoken about with like the pre-hinge as well.
Yeah, that kind of feeds into starting position, right? Because if your head's down looking down, it's going to bias you towards being a bit more flex versus, full head up to the extreme. That's going to put you in a more extended position. Think something like Yuri Belkin back in the days, right? I guess we could circle back and kind of cover the slack pull and the wedge a bit more. I think we got a bit carried away, but slack pull, right? So I guess it's more important in sumo, but it still does apply really well to conventional, right? And how we spoke about, you want to be flowy and not so rigid. And I think one important part of that is trying to get into the most advantageous position that you can, given your leverages. And by being flowy, being relaxed, and pulling the slack out of the bar as well as your arms, I think it's a really good concept and worth putting into your routine. Pretty much all deadlifters that can do it really well just have a really efficient starting position, right? So what the slack pull is, I guess you could think about it like a piece of string, right? If you were to try pull that piece of string taut, you wouldn't necessarily just yank at it and pull it tight, because then there ends up being feedback and there's some like recoil in the hands. But if you slowly pull it out, it ends up being taut and you can maneuver that, control that whichever way you like. Same thing happens with a barbell, except it's just not as noticeable because it's not a piece of string, it's a piece of metal, right? But that being said, I think we could talk about overdoing a slack pull versus underdoing it, right? I'll kick things off with talking about overdoing it. I think when we try and take out all the slack, right, you want to be in a position where you haven't fully met the bar and you're not in the most advantageous position yet before you pull the slack, right? The slack pull's there to get your arms nice and long and prepare yourself to be able to wedge into the bar so that then you are in the best position possible. But if you really make a big effort to take all that slack out and overdo it and push too hard, it makes it really difficult to then rotate yourself in and wedge in without, I guess, compromising your position somewhere. I imagine like the most limiting factor is going to bend, right? Whether that's the bar coming off the floor or your back end up rounding or something like that, right? So if we think about like pushing through the ground as hard as you can and then try to rotate, I commonly see, like I said, the back starting to flex and the hips trying to meet the bar to try and overcome how hard you've been pushing into the floor. And generally that's a sign where I see it's like you might be overdoing the slack, and instead you could think about gradually pulling the slack out of the bar, and wedging in gradually.
Yep.
Sam, did you want to talk about underdoing it?
I was just about
Or
to
your
agree with
take as
you
well?
there, Danny.
Yeah.
I definitely think the most kind of efficient way to go about the slack pull is that nice gradual process coming simultaneously from the feet and then also the head and arms. So like, as you're wedging in, it's almost like going 0 to 100 where the percentage of how much you're pushing is increasing as you're driving in. So by the time your hips are at the bar in your starting position, you're at 100%. You're not at 100% when your hips are high in the air. I think that's, like you said, a good way to make sure that we're finding this balance between being fluid and loose, but not being too like kind of aggressive with it, where you end up just going to tug at it too hard and get pulled anyway. I think the biggest thing in terms of underdoing it, like I was kind of talking about before, is where you'll see a change in your hip position. So if you're undoing that wedge and you're not building enough tension with the barbell is going to want to pull you out of position before it leaves the floor. So you'll typically see like, your shoulders move forward, your upper back flex, your hips pop up in the air, or they'll at like heavy kind of loads, there'll be like that little delay and lag off the floor as well. So yeah, finding that sweet spot between just that gradual build up and driving into the bar and allowing it to come from both the legs and the upper body simultaneously.
Yeah.
I think you
Another
can
sign I think
also
about when you're underdoing slack pull is kind of like if you just get straight up yanking it. If you don't pull the slack at all and you just go 0 to 100, that's a common sign that you're underdoing the slack pull. Like that's not even a concept, right? So
Yeah.
I think if you're coming from underdoing it, like you said, Sam, trialing that gradual process is a good way to go. But yeah, you go, Leanne. Sorry, I think I cut you off there.
That's all right. All good. I was just going to say as well, like, especially if you're on a deadlift bar, I know I have a few clients who are in federations that use a deadlift bar, and you can really see it, especially as they get towards their top end. And if they're not taking enough slack pull, then that's where you're really going to get stuck. And it's like being able to practice that at lighter loads, even though it's light, being able to still generate that slack pull as you get heavier, you're going to find it much easier because it's pretty much just exaggerating that slack pull on a deadlift bar.
I find really quick on deadlift bars, just like cueing clients, the difference between deadlift bar and stiff bar. I think on deadlift bar, you have to physically pull more slack out. Like you have to physically like pull more with your arms to break that whip out of the bar. Whereas with a stiff bar, you don't want to pull too much because that's going to alter your starting position and get you too rigid in your arms. You want to have it kind of more from the legs and just being kind of head pulling to the roof. Whereas with the whippy bar, because there is so much kind of slack that needs to be pulled out,
I think
find
Sam's cut
cueing
out,
clients.
but I'll try and continue what he was talking about.
Am I cut out?
I was just gonna like add in like that there's like two different ways that we will see it, like, and you can coach it in a sense of like that people are either gonna pull it first or like pull and push the slack and then wedge, or they do it simultaneously. And I think like there's no right or wrong in that instance. It's just like coaching around like what the athlete feels like they can obviously execute across the board. They would be the most two common ways. And I think like it'll tie into both. I think the people or the athletes who kind of push and pull it first and then they wedge, that's where we will usually see it being overdone, where we'll see like, I guess while they're pushing and pulling the slack first, they usually move into flexion, like they don't actually hold the extension as they push and pull the tension, so they end like their wedge ends up being really tucky. Or the clients who try and do it, or athletes who try and do it, and they can't quite get the timing of doing it simultaneously. They don't get the pop of the bar off the floor. There's usually a delay. Like they wedge in and then the bar leaves the ground, rather than wedging in and the bar just moving off the ground straight away. So it's just finding that happy medium between both. I think personally, like for me in my experience, like coaching or cueing athletes to like trial it by pushing and pulling the slack first helps them to feel what they need to do, and then eventually leading them into kind of doing it simultaneously, because like it's definitely, like I would say in my experience, a stronger position, and we see like I guess less positional breakdown doing it that way.
Yeah, for sure. I think a lot of my posts recently have been around like sequencing, creating a checklist, and this applies very much to what we're talking about still, right? Like when you're talking about the slack pull, you could sequence it in different ways. You could either like push to the ground and then push to the torso. You could do it simultaneously. But I think it's important to make sure that like each step that you do is intentional. Because like you said, if you're doing it in a way where you're not completely aware of what you're doing and you're pushing the slack through the ground as well as pulling your torso up to the sky, and you're not, I guess, you're not too sure of how much output you're putting both ways, that could end up changing your position, like you said, right? So like
Yeah.
understanding what you're used to and then making those small tweaks is really helpful.
I also want to. This will probably tie into like what we'll talk about next, which will be probably like grip width, but it's also the like the people, or like sometimes when you see people like push and pull multiple times, like they're like they do like 3 or 4 pushes and pulls against the bar, and they're like hands are opening and closing on the bar, and they're kind of fiddling around with that starting position. Like that's where we
Yeah.
usually see a lot of breakdown as well. Sometimes occur.
Yeah. I guess like that's a sign where you're not completely trusting of the sequencing that you're creating, or if anything, it could be like a preparation thing. Like you need those 2 or 3, I guess, pseudo tugs to actually initiate off the floor. But I'd I'd argue you don't necessarily need to be doing it 2, 3, 4, 5 times to the point where you're wasting energy doing that, right? Um, I I like to tell people, especially when you're in that pre-hinge position and you're trying to pull the slack, like you could try and mentally rehearse it, and you're not physically trying to, do those multiple sequences of pushing and pulling. That way you're not wasting energy, and by the time you grab the bar for the first time, it's kind of like linked up where you can push and pull at the same time, or you can time it correctly. Sweet. I guess we could kind of transition this over to sumo then, right? So again, think big picture. We're talking pre-hinge, pulling the slack, and then wedging. And then when we talk about sumo, you add this extra layer of complexity on it by standing wider, and then you get 2 things that you can start to change. You got your stance width of how far you're moving your feet out towards the bar, and there's no limit to that except for like the plates touching. And there's also your toe angle as well, right? Those 2 things in and of themselves already change your leverages drastically when you are pulling conventional versus pulling sumo, right? One, it reduces range of motion, and 2, generally, it also allows you to take a more upright position. So sumo ends up becoming less of a like pure hinge, and it also becomes almost like a hand loaded squat, somewhat, right? Shania, did you want to open up and talk about like how stance width can kind of play into what happens?
Yeah, for sure. I think like I'm gonna say it. Everyone's always like, "Oh, sumo's the cheetah lift," because of like the range of motion thing. But like sumo is like way technically harder. Like conventional, you can like if your position isn't 100%, like you can pretty much grip and rip. And if you're within a threshold of load, like it'll just fucking move. Sam's got a lot of experience in that.
Yeah.
Whereas like I think with sumo, it's like the breakdown of being like 1% off is like that's it, like you don't have it basically. So I think I would say like it is highly dependent on leverages in a sense of like what position you end up getting strong in for sumo, whether you're like really wide, whether you're sort of like just like a normal sumo with kind of like where the line is on the ring, and just so the ring is on the bar and lining your legs up there. For me personally, I use where the ring is on the bar as just like a guide to start, and then I'll either move someone in or out accordingly. Um, I think if I talk about my sumo specifically, like given how long my leverages are, I've always stuck to just being like sort of normal sumo, where I just line my shins up with the bar, the ring, and it's just been strong for me since. And I'm more of like an externally rotated sumo lifter, so my toes sort of point out in the direction of the plates, and it's just always been comfortable. I've never had like issues in terms of hip pain or anything like that, which can be a major contributor into having to change sumo position or sumo stance. And I've just been able to get stronger since from there. So I would say it's just, yeah, it's highly dependent. I would probably use like David as an example, as someone who's probably trialed a lot of different positions on his sumo. And that just comes down to, again, leverages. So like I pretty much have no torso. So my sumo is very upright. It's very leggy. I don't really use a lot of erectors or back in my movement from a sense of having to hold extension. Whereas somebody like David, like he's quite hinged still in his sumo because of his longer torso and shorter legs. And he's trialed being, I guess, like lining his legs up with the ring on the bar and also going super wide and neutral feet. I would just honestly say, like, as a coach, like it's trialing, and it comes down to whether you get niggles in your hips or if something doesn't feel strong. They're like the two biggest things I would say influence like what position you'll be in sumo. I would say the biggest thing that goes wrong at times is people trying to force themselves into an upright position when not everyone will be an upright sumo lifter. Like, if you are somebody of like similar to David's leverages, you know, where you have shorter femurs, a longer torso, you're never going to be an upright sumo. So trying to do that is just going to force too much of a tuck. Danny's laughing. You'll just force too much of a tuck, and it'll just end up creating like just like a weaker position for you. So embracing that hinge is like the best thing you can do for yourself, and just getting stronger there. And then that is where I would say like sumo and conventional, but I would say then it's like a matter of needing to manage, you know, fatigue in terms of like where you get fatigue bleeding as well, because that will be a big contributor to it.
Yeah. A lot to unpack and follow up with you there, but I think the main thing that stuck out most recently is leverages, and you're never going to be upright, right? I think with sumo, you're definitely going to be more upright in comparison to if you as the same person went to pull conventional. But like you said, like your individual leverages aren't going to change, right? So, you know, you could try and set up, and that ends up being the most efficient position possible. But if you're comparing yourself to someone who's got like longer limbs, shorter torso, like it's just very unrealistic that you're going to achieve the same starting position, right? Touching on stance width as well, I think like everyone is technically going to be their most quote unquote biomechanically efficient when you're looking at like a range of motion if you stand at your widest, similar to wide grip benching and having your index fingers on the rings, right? Like just looking at how much range of motion you cover it's going to be the most advantageous, but there's huge limitations there, right? Like everyone's hip socket's different, torso's different, and so like the hips or groin or adductors might not be able to tolerate that position, right? So yes, it's efficient to be standing wide, but can your body tolerate it and do it sustainably and allow you to accumulate the work needed to get stronger in it? That's the part that gets questionable, right? So I think stance width is one of those things where it's like it's similar to bench press grip, where it's like you can try and inch it wider and wider to the point where your adductors or your hips start giving you issues, and that's probably the upper limit, if not already a bit past the limit of where you should be starting, right? So like Shania said, a good starting place could be shins at the bar. That's a pretty healthy place to start. A lot of people can generally achieve it. But then when you start looking into like toes touching the plates, that's probably an extreme case where, you know, mobility allowing, leverages allowing, that's probably like upper range of what people can achieve.
Yeah, I'd also say like you just said, like sumo obviously does bias more, you know, external rotation given it is already in a wide stance movement. So I would say like being like super wide, the one thing I look at is like if you're wide and feet are touching like the plates, for me personally it's not strong because it's like my feet are under my knees. So I feel like I personally have no push. So that's one thing that I look at with like clients. Sometimes you'll see like smaller weight females, someone like 47, like Vicky, like depending how wide she goes, like it might be really good for them because again, from a range of motion perspective, it's kind of obviously decreases it again, but it's a matter of like how much push you feel like you can create being that wide. And then I would say, again, touching on like actual foot position around like toes out or feet neutral, it kind of just comes down to, again, whether like your hips allow you to either be, wide stance ER, toes out, externally rotated to then produce force, or do you need to be wide stance ER but toes or feet neutral to be able to produce force? Like which one is strongest for you? And that's where it is just so, I guess, like trial and error. Like it's probably sumo is the one that we might need to like experiment that little bit more in, because you could have no issues with your position and then you might get to a top end and then all of a sudden you're like, I've got hip pain, so then you need to like work backwards and like adjust what you need to adjust. So I think that's why like sumo can be that little bit more tricky with just one, predictability of performance in training and competition, but also the position that you need to be in.
Yeah. Another part I think about when you brought up toes in versus toes out is also the balance aspect of it. If you look at from a side angle, right, and someone's got their toes fully turned out, the only base of support is that little sliver of toe that you've got, like looking from a side angle, right? There's not much base of support balancing you there. So force production might go up if you're able to push the knees out and keep them from hitting the bar. But if you can't balance it, and I've seen people just like fall over once they get to the lockout, or they're struggling to balance on the way up. I think that's a common issue with having toes pointing too far out and not being able to manage that. And I guess having your toes facing forward again, like you said, Shania, it's a more reliable position to be in. Generally, a lot of people have those range of motion abilities rather than going fully externally rotated. So I think the plus side of that is you're able to balance a lot more. You have more base of support there. But you kind of, I guess, the drawback of that is not being able to push the shins out to the side of the bar. So they kind of have to run in, and you kind of have to opt for that more hingier position where the hips are a bit further away from the bar, right? Like you said, you're never going to be a fully upright lifter, which is copium for poorly leveraged deadlifters. Short arms, long torso. Not particularly. You go, Shania.
I hate using myself as like an example to show how to sumo, because like my leverages are just like that little bit more of like an outlier in that sense. Because I'm always like, if I have to use myself, I'll always be like, don't try and get into my position, please. Just like look at what I'm like addressing specifically. Otherwise, like I get a lot of clients always being like, why can't I get this upright? And I'm like, it doesn't matter. Like, don't worry about it. Like, it's still going to be strong.
Yeah, I think as well, like if your leverages aren't built to deadlift, doesn't mean that you can't deadlift. Like you just have to work to what your leverages are. Like you look at, I can't remember his name, but there's one guy who's like not built, I think he's in the US, and he's not built to deadlift at all, but like he just makes it work. And I always refer my clients to some of his videos. I'm like, if he can make that work, then you can as well. And it's just like being patient with it and finding what works for you, rather than like just looking at people who are really efficient and built to deadlift. It's like you're not going to look like them, and it's like just being okay with that and finding what is going to work for you.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's easy to get into the conversation of leverages for deadlift because it's that lift that favors leverages so much. Like if you're predisposed to having long arms, short torso, like you're gonna be good to tug, right? Like you see people, not a lot of musculature, not a lot of time in the sport, and yet they're pulling something like astronomical, right? But that's just the nature of deadlift.
There was a French, what was he? French 59 or maybe even lighter, sub junior, just recently pulled like 221 at like 50 kilo. Or what did he was super lightweight, sub junior, pulling 221. And like you said, like probably not been in the sport for very long, but just built for it and able to kind of get these strength gains like straight away. But yeah, like Leanne said, you can't like look at people like that. You got to kind of always work within what you've got and work within your strengths and play the time game and just get stronger
Yeah,
at
for
it.
sure. I guess we could try close things up for those people that don't have these super amazing deadlift leverages. How do people actually get stronger then without having super long arms, short torso kind of thing? What kind of muscle groups do we look at? How can you kind of train these movements so that you can get stronger despite whatever leverages you have?
Get a strong hinge,
Strong back.
strong back, strong erectors. Get really
Strong
good
erectors.
RDLing.
Yeah.
Like-
Typically it'll be like needing a stronger lower back, right? If we look at someone who's not quite built for deadlifts. So just, laying out your program in a way where you can push your hinge accessories, but also, also allowing progression for your main lifts as well. So making sure like, your accessories are laid out in your program to balance out also your SPD.
Yeah, for sure. Like someone who isn't predisposed to deadlifting isn't going to be able to do super high volumes same way someone who's doing like super efficient sumo is going to be, right? So I guess one way you could cover it is, you've got your main deadlift work and supplementing a lot of that with, like you said, lower back extensor work. So I think 45-degree hyper, RDLs, whether that's barbell or dumbbell, single arm variations, things like that, all end up accumulating and helping your extensors to be able to tolerate the starting position a lot more. But yeah, I think for now, that's a good place to kind of finish things off with deadlifts. There's a lot of things to consider, but to simplify things, it always comes down to trying to get really good at the following 3 things. So pre-hinge, setting up the slack pull really well, not overdoing it or not underdoing it, and then wedging in properly. But yeah, thanks guys for listening to another episode of The Roundtable, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.